Hi, I'm John Molesky. Welcome to America's 360. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies, and America's 360 is a collaboration among the Wilson Center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. In this special Hispanic Heritage Month episode, we're going to discuss the term Latinx, what it means, how it's used, and who does and doesn't identify with it. Identity, and specifically how we choose to identify ourselves, is a timeless theme with issues of gender, race, ethnicity, and all manifestations of identity looming large throughout the Americas. Awareness and use of the term Latinx, a gender-neutral and pan-ethnic label, has risen in recent years. Despite this, the term has been heard by only a small segment of the population it's meant to describe, and it's used by even a smaller group. The Pew Research Center released a report this past August on the use of the term. To provide insight into the emergence of Latinx, we'll kick off this episode with Mariana Sanchez Ramirez, a producer of America's 360 and a program assistant with the Canada Institute. Mariana's special guest is Mark Hugo López from the Pew Research Center. Take it away, Mariana and Mark.
Thank you, John, and welcome Mark Hugo López from the Pew Research Center. He is the Director of Global Migration and Demography Research. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, with John's great introduction, let's start off this conversation regarding Latinx with a very important yet basic question. Can you please define to our audience what is Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx?
Well, these are all three terms that have emerged in the United States to describe the population of people who trace their roots to Latin America and to Spain. Now, there are some formal definitions. Hispanic, for example, is formally defined by the federal government to include people who trace their roots to any of the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America or to Spain. Now, more recently, in the 1990s, the term Latino and Latina emerged as an alternative pan-ethnic term, and it's one that's really meant to emphasize the Latin American roots of the population. And some may even say excludes a place like Spain, but includes a place like Brazil. Latinx is an alternative to these two, and particularly an alternative to the pan-ethnic terms of Latino and Latina. And Latinx emerged, by the way, in the 90s. It's been around for a while, but it's only recently begun to get a lot more use. And again, I want to stress that it has roots in the United States. It's meant to be gender neutral, but it is another pan-ethnic alternative to describe a population that is quite diverse within the United States.
Great. And to follow up on that question, Mark, tell us a bit more about how widespread is the awareness and the use of Latinx in the United States?
So in a survey that we did last December, we asked the U.S. population of people who identify as Hispanic or Latino whether or not they've ever heard of the term Latinx. That was the first question we asked. We found that 23% had heard of the term, but 3/4 hadn't heard of Latinx itself. So this really does fit with a lot of the conversations I've had around the country in recent years, asking people if they've heard of the term Latinx. And interestingly, many people just haven't heard of it. Now, among those who have heard of it, we did ask, do you use it yourself to describe your identity? And we found in total among all adults, 3% of all Latino adults say that they use the term Latinx to describe themselves. That was the key and most important finding, I think, of this report. And I want to stress, this is not a report that says the public has a thumbs up or a thumbs down, an approval of the term Latinx. We didn't ask that at all. We just asked, have you heard of it and do you use it? And interestingly, those who have heard of it are more likely to be college educated, younger, US born, English speakers first and foremost, and also tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party. And those who tend to use it oftentimes tend to be, again, younger, college educated, Democratic leaning. But interestingly, it is young Hispanic women who, in our work, are most likely to say that they use it to describe themselves. About 15% of them do.
Wow, that's just fascinating. And it really speaks to the nuances regarding which demographics identify, not necessarily identify, but actually have awareness about the term Latinx. And can you delve into, you just briefly touched upon it, but other factors that play in whether or not US Hispanics are aware about Latinx? Any specific examples that really drew your attention?
Well, again, it's those who tend to be younger and college educated. And I think that really reflects where Latinx's use started to really rise. It started to rise first in universities because in the 1990s, there was a desire to have not only an alternative to Hispanic, but a pan-ethnic label for the population that would describe or at least be representative of the multitude of experiences within the population. That's where you see Latino emerge, but also Latina/O, or Latin with the @ sign to represent both the O and the A at the same time, to again capture the multitude of experiences around gender that are part of the story of these people who trace their roots to Latin America. Latinx comes out of that same movement to have this gender neutral, very pan-ethnic, and very broad term that can capture a multitude of experiences. So that's where you think about Latinx. Who is most likely to have heard of it? Well, those who've had some college experiences, because that's where it first emerged to describe Latino studies, in this case, Latinx studies programs at the university level. More recently, though, since the Pulse nightclub shooting, it's become more common to see it in news reporting. You see celebrities using it more often now as well. Corporations use it too. And it's really striking that many people, particularly those who are in leadership positions or have an opportunity to shape the conversation around this, have been using it more than, say, the public itself, which is still generally unaware. I want to say that it also doesn't mean that eventually we might not see the public become more aware of it and perhaps even adopt it as a term in the future.
Great. And one final question for you, Mark. What are your final thoughts, if any, about Latinx and its potential acceptance and into more of the mainstream U.S. society in the coming years?
Well, I think that one striking thing that's happening in the U.S. and frankly around the world is a broad movement to have language that gives people the flexibility to identify themselves how they want to identify. And that is true not only of race and ethnicity, but also around gender identity. So for example, in the U.S., we've had a movement towards the use of pronouns, people telling you what pronouns they prefer if you're going to refer to them or address them. That is something that's more accepted among younger Americans than it is among older Americans. Similar pattern to Latinx. Outside of the United States, in Latin America particularly, we've seen the emergence of Latin E, an alternative to Latinx, so Latine, so that when you pronounce the word, you can actually pronounce it. And that's one of the criticisms of Latinx, that it's hard to pronounce that in Spanish. But Latin E and its various forms, like, for example, rather than saying todos and todas, you can say todes. That is an example of where using an E as opposed to an O and an A gives you a gender neutral but pronounceable version of words in Spanish. So I think this is part of a broader international movement. I think Latinx might rise in use, but it remains to be seen whether or not it could be supplanted by something else.
Well, Mark Hugo López, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center, thank you so much for joining us today on America's 360.
Thank you.
Back to you, John.
Thanks, Mariana. And special thanks to Mark and to the Pew Research Center. When we return, we'll conduct a special edition of the Roundtable, continuing our exploration of the term Latinx. Stick around. You're listening to America's 360. Welcome back to America's 360. Before the transition, I mentioned that this episode's roundtable would be of the special variety. Here's what's different. Our regulars have stepped away this week as we welcome a group of young Latino professionals for our discussion of the term Latinx. They are Rachel Schmidtke, advocate for Latin America at Refugees International.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
Rachel, great to see you. Eric Acuna, a comedian, actor, and writer.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Eric, I have to ask you, when people are introduced as a comedian, there's almost an expectation that you have to be funny. If we introduce a doctor, we don't ask them to perform surgery during the discussion. You feeling any pressure in that regard?
Not at all, because all of my friends and family always ask me to tell a joke when I say that I'm a comedian, and I'm like, I'm not going to do that.
Well, that is optional. We're going to be fair to comedians today and not put undue pressure on you. Alexa Rodriguez joins us. She's director of Trans Latinx DMV. Hi, Alexa.
Hi, everyone.
Olivia Soledad is a program assistant with the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, John. Thank you for having me.
And back by popular demand, Mariana Sanchez Ramirez, who you just heard from during our Spotlight interview with Mark Hugo López. Welcome back, Mariana.
Thanks, John.
So as has become clear in our discussion, in my lead-in, in the interview with Mark, labels are almost impossible to escape. Many of us, particularly journalists, are guilty as charged of using them as a type of shorthand in order to be able to talk about big groups of people. So almost an unnecessary evil, but words are seldom neutral, and words also have meaning and power. And I introduced all of you as a group of young Latino professionals, which offers varying degrees of accuracy. Right from my perspective, you're certainly young, maybe from a child's not so young. So all of these things are somewhat imperfect. Latinx attempts to offer a more inclusive term. We talked about Latino and Latina, and Mark in the interview talked about Latin E or Latina. So we've got a smorgasbord of topics, or I should say titles to choose from. So what I'd like to do is sort of just hear what you identify with. Let's do a across the round table in the order of introduction. And do you associate with any of these terms more one than another? Do you see any of the terms as being superior for any particular reason or more accurate for any particular reason? Rachel Schmidtke, can we begin with you?
Sure, John. So personally, I identify as Latina. That's because my gender identity coincides with my, I guess, sex at birth that I was assigned. So I prefer Latina, but I am very curious and would love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on this term.
Eric, your thoughts?
I identify as Latino just because I identify as a male, but with my friends that are Americans, they call me, and now I feel also fine just identifying as Latinx because a lot of my friends now use that term a lot. So I'm fine with either Latino or Latinx.
Alexa.
So I identify as a Latina, same as my friends here because of my gender identity. I urge sometimes people not to use the Latinx if they don't know what it's about, because people just assuming and they put in titles or tags on us. And instead of asking, are you okay using the Latinx? So you identify as a Latinx.
Olivia.
I also identify as a Latina for similar reasons than Rachel. But as Eric also mentioned, I don't usually have a problem or even take any sort of issue or pay attention if people were to define me as Latinx.
Thanks. Mariana?
So I too identify as Latina, but with that being said, I exist in a multiplicity of spaces in my professional and personal life. So definitely it really depends on the situation and where I am, but I am not afraid or uncomfortable with Latinx.
But your answers sort of bring up a question about the utility of these titles in general. Alexa, you raised the caution sign about using the term without sort of approval. So my question, and I'll begin with you, Alexa, is who gets to decide what we're called?
I guess the person who identify as. For example, when I think Mark says something like the question about pronouns. So if I identify as a trans Latina indigenous woman, so I have so many identities in my skin that it can be identified as a Latinx, but I know that. But when I'm saying that I'm a trans Latina woman, that's how I want to be addressed. If the person is just assuming that I identify as a Latinx, that for me is wrong. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but just because it's a trend or people think that it's a trend or a new thing, they want to put us in one spot. So for me, people need to understand what is Latinx, what is to be a Latinx person, because it's not only for identity purpose, it's for many things. And when we know what it's about, we can be an ally for Latinx community, not only because it's representing an ethnicity or a group of people, but also for people who are gender non-binary and non-conforming. But just because it's a trend, I don't see it like it's appropriate.
Yeah, I agree with what you say, Alexa, about how you should identify as how you feel like. And at least in the spaces where I work in comedy and theater, most of American people, I had these conversations like, why are you using the term Latinx? Because I feel like that's the term that a lot of people use now, mostly American people that are not Latinos, Latinas, or Latinx. And they usually say, I feel like it's a safe term, which I find they're very interesting. A lot of people just saying, I feel like that's a safe term. I feel like I'm not going to upset anyone if I use the term Latinx. But I think that that's just their belief, right? Because they could actually piss someone off if they use that term. But I feel like that's at least the reasons that I've heard, even in auditions when they said Latinx, is just, this is the safe way to identify these people so that we don't upset anyone.
But that's the tricky part. Like they can be being like, oh no, I'm inclusive, so let me use this term. But in the reality, it's like, just for using the term doesn't mean that you are being an ally or you're being inclusive. So we ask always people who use the X or the Latinx, are you inclusive? Do you have non-binary people in your staff? Do you have non-binary people in your friendship environment? All those things, all those questions, all those conversations need to be raised, because when we just use it to me feel safe or to be okay, that's not okay, actually. So that can be violence, because we don't know how the other people in front of me identify such as.
I wonder, I'm sorry, Alexa, go ahead. Finish your thought, I'm sorry.
No, like in my culture, we call gringos to the white people, and they don't like that. But it's my culture, and that's how I learned to call Caucasian people, their identity. But I learned now that I have to use proper political, I don't know how to say it, but like, proper terms, just
acceptable, politically correct. Yeah, whatever the case might be. That which raises the question of who's the referee, right? So I want to ask some of the others, when you're approaching this, not personally, but professionally, and you're writing or you're speaking, how do you choose the right term, and how do you keep track of what is, as Alexa just put it, the most acceptable at any given moment? You think of the evolution of Black, then African American, and now Black has made a comeback in America. For a while, African American was predominantly preferred, but no longer the case. Now it's a mixed bag. How do you make those determinations, Mariana, Olivia, Rachel, when you're writing, when you're speaking?
So, John, that's a great point that you mentioned, and that actually speaks to the aspect of the term Hispanic was first used by the US government in the 1970s, after Mexican Americans and other Hispanic organizations lobbied to the federal government to identify the population. And subsequently, in the US Census Bureau, it wasn't actually stipulated in the Census Bureau until the 1980 census. So again, when we talk about identity and kind of categorizing or where we place people in what box, I think it's definitely an evolution, and it evolves, to Mark's point, that similar to the language, right? That what we may see in the next 5 or 10 years in regards to the, not necessarily adoption, but the introduction of Latinx into a more mainstream aspect of the Latino community is only a matter of time.
I think, John, from what I've seen, and even just across social media, is where I get a lot of, or where I try to assess the perception of these terms. I do definitely agree that gender inclusivity has been a topic, obviously, in the United States, and Latin America has followed as well, although there's obviously large issues that affect people in terms of gender and accepting that diversity. But I will say that it's interesting to see this rise of Latine, or as Mark also mentioned, the use of the @ sign to encompass both the A and the O, although obviously that doesn't encompass those that are gender non-binary. But what I also wanted to say about this is that, I think the pushback that I've gotten from people that have either not heard of Latinx or just weren't familiar with it is that they see it as originating from the United States, and it's sort of this tension or this habit of the United States trying to encompass a group of people under one umbrella. Right?
Does that lead to automatic pushback because it's a U.S. imposed term?
I mean, a lot of times in my own life, it seems to be the case. And, there's reasons for it. right? Everybody wants the ability to identify themselves. And if the United States, for their convenience of whether it be the Census Bureau or just to identify these groups in their politics, if it makes it easier for them to create this term, then yes, you're sort of taking that ability away from these people. So I feel like that's a large area where I've seen pushback from communities in Latin America.
So Rachel, when you're public speaking or writing, how do you choose?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. And I actually want to jump on Olivia's point a little bit in that when I was working for a long period of time in Peru, I used the @ symbol typically in writing. That was something that was sort of being pushed in a lot of circles to be more inclusive. And so when I came to the United States to start working here, it felt a little bit like the term Latinx was the appropriate term to use. And in the work that I do, I focus quite a lot on people who are fleeing persecution, in particular in Central America, because of their gender identity or gender expression. And so we're always trying to use the terms that are, the most dignifying to people. But it is challenging because you don't want to have pushback for using something that might not be accessible for international audiences. So generally I'll either use Latinx or I'll use the term Latin sometimes as well. But I actually do appreciate the term Latine, and I'm curious to see if that will actually pick up steam at some point.
Eric, I wonder, when policy analysts are walking on eggshells when it comes to terminology and trying to get it right for all kinds of reasons. Comedians, not so much, right? You're cracking eggshells. Is this terminology as a consideration in your work as a comedian?
Definitely. I've encountered so many things. I was born and raised in Peru, and then I've just been living in DC for 8 years. And throughout all those years, I definitely encountered that most of the people involved in comedy are white straight men, and they're not very they don't usually know what the terms they should be used. And that's why I was saying that recently I realized that a lot of my mostly liberal friends either work in that industry use the term Latinx. I've been trying to get together with a lot of other people that identify as Latinos, Latinas, or Latinx in the comedy scene to kind of like raise awareness of what those labels mean, because also the word Hispanic is being thrown, and it's just there's a big difference among all of those categories, like it was mentioned before. So I think it's very important to especially like raise awareness to people, to American people, about the different terms that we use. And at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is how each one wants to identify.
Now, we're moving into our final minutes, and I want to give each of you a chance for a final thought. And one of the clear and present dangers we haven't discussed explicitly, but it's implicit in the whole discussion, is that labels run the risk of creating a monolith. And that's always inaccurate just by definition. We had our discussion last week in our last episode about the Latino vote in the upcoming U.S. election. And obviously, that's not something that can be spoken about as a singular type of undertaking. And I think that's also the risk here. But I'm wondering, as we move forward, final thought from each of you, how you see this evolving. Who will drive? Are policymakers and politicians involved in driving the conversation? Is it journalists? Is it individual activists, young people? Who will have the final say as we move forward? And what's your thought on any closing thought of anything we haven't had a chance for you to discuss so far? Alexa, let's begin with you.
Sure. I think it will be individual community advocacy and activism, because every change that I have seen, I have lived in the United States for the last 11 years almost. Every change that I have seen, it begins in the community. So it will continue that way until we go to the politician and people in power to make a change.
Thanks. Olivia.
I agree with Alexa. I think it's really going to come down to an individual level with their close friends and family. I can say, for example, my family was always conservative and raised religiously, and issues of gender are always sort of like hush hush and hard to touch. But it starts with people that want to talk about it, and you just have to be willing to open that conversation. And family members do react once you start seeing that this isn't something that we can just stay quiet about for much longer. And I think what is part of the precious thing of having these conversations is that you realize that we're not a monolith, right? Even in just this group of 5 young people that belong to this generation, we all have different opinions about how we feel when identifying with the term Latinx, maybe how widespread we think it'll be. But all these opinions are important because they all go against this idea that we are a monolith, because we're not. And we all want a voice in saying who identifies us and how we can respect people who identify different than we do.
Mariana.
Well, I think this goes to show the amount of code switching that goes into just who we are as human beings and how we identify and exist in different spaces. And I think to my panelists earlier remarks, I think it really speaks to how we have to change and evolve and really start these conversations from the family unit into the policy space, into the research space. I think that conversation has to start from a very early point of view, but I definitely see this issue being an initial conversation in many spaces, both in your personal life, but also in your professional life as well.
Thanks. Eric.
Yeah, I agree with everyone here that that change has to start from a local level, from us, from grassroots levels, and also from each of our own area of work or expertise, and either in the academia or civil society, or even from the comedy aspect. Like I wrote a one-person show that is mostly directed to white American people, and where I pretty much tell about my story as a Latino living in Peru and then just moving to DC a couple of years ago, and just explaining the terms of Hispanic, of Latino, Latinx. So that generates a big impact on them, and you're like, at the end of the show, they are like, oh, I didn't know these are the differences. That's so interesting. So whenever in any field that we can do our part, I think it's always important to just like establish like, hey, at the end of the day, it's us that should define ourselves and not someone else.
Yeah, the arts certainly shouldn't be underestimated, right? So much terminology, even what we name babies, is a function of pop culture, of storytelling, of the arts. So it has a big say in how we talk about ourselves and about our world. And Rachel, you have the pressure of the final word. Don't blow it.
Ooh, pressure. No, I agree with everything that my fellow panelists said. I think that the people have the power to influence policymakers. And I think the important thing is that policymakers start not only looking for gender inclusive language, but moving to inclusive policies that take into account the needs of all of us in the Latinx, Latine community, and not just centering on one specific population. And so hopefully more inclusive policies in the future. That's what I'm hoping for.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We'll need to leave it there. Rachel, Eric, Alexa, Olivia, Mariana, thank you very much for participating in our special Hispanic Heritage Month episode of America's 360. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And to our listeners, if there's a topic you'd like us to cover on America's 360, or perhaps a guest you'd like to hear from, let us know. You can reach us via email at americas360@wilsoncenter.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center and America's 360, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. America's 360 is produced and edited by Oscar Cruz, Angela Robertson, and Mariana Sanchez Ramirez. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.